In a dimly lit attic studio that reeked of turpentine and old varnish, renowned artist Elias Grayson worked tirelessly on his latest commission. The client, a reclusive millionaire named Victor Ashcroft, had demanded a masterpiece worthy of his opulent estate. He requested a portrait of himself, one that would immortalize his power and grandeur. Though Elias found Ashcroft's arrogant demeanor unsettling, the promise of a hefty sum was too tempting to refuse. Ashcroft's piercing gray eyes, sharp cheekbones, and thin-lipped smile were etched into Elias's mind as he painted. Day after day, he poured his soul into the portrait, but something about it began to feel off. The colors seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, the eyes followed him no matter where he stood, and the faintest whispers tickled the edges of his consciousness. He chalked it up to exhaustion and pressed on. After weeks of labor, the portrait was complete. It depicted Ashcroft seated in a grand chair, draped in a crimson robe that exuded wealth and authority. The background was an elaborate library, its shelves filled with ancient tomes. Yet, despite its perfection, the painting unsettled Elias. It felt alive, as though it were watching him. When Ashcroft came to collect the piece, his reaction was peculiar. He stared at the portrait unnervingly long, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "You've outdone yourself, Elias," he said, his voice laced with satisfaction. "This will hang in my study. You're a genius." But as the days turned into weeks, strange rumors began to circulate. Ashcroft had suffered a freak accident, falling down the grand staircase of his mansion. He survived, but only barely. Elias thought little of it until he heard an unsettling detail. The crimson robe in the portrait had been marred with a smear of blood, one that hadn't been there before. Curious and unnerved, Elias paid a visit to Ashcroft's mansion under the guise of checking on his client's recovery. The portrait hung in the study as promised, but it had changed. Ashcroft's face now bore a faint bruise on his temple, and his once pristine robe was stained with crimson. "It's remarkable," Ashcroft said when he caught Elias staring. "The portrait evolves as if it's a living record of my life." Elias's stomach churned. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light or his imagination, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. That night, he dreamt of the portrait. Ashcroft's painted figure reached out, its lips twisting into a grotesque smile as blood poured from its eyes. When Elias awoke, drenched in sweat, he resolved to investigate. He spent days researching cursed artifacts and haunted objects. What he found chilled him to the bone. Tales of paintings imbued with malevolent spirits, capable of bending reality and foretelling doom. Each story ended in tragedy for those who owned or created the cursed works. One evening, as Elias was reviewing his sketches, a knock echoed through his studio. A trembling servant stood at the door with an urgent message from Ashcroft. "Mr. Grayson, sir, Master Ashcroft requests your presence immediately. He's unwell." When Elias arrived at the mansion, he found Ashcroft in his study, pale and trembling. The portrait had changed again. Now, it depicted Ashcroft surrounded by shadowy figures, their skeletal hands reaching for him. The crimson robe was drenched in blood, and Ashcroft's expression was one of abject terror. "It's predicting my death," Ashcroft whispered, clutching a glass of brandy that trembled in his hand. "They're coming for me." "Who?" Elias demanded, but Ashcroft only shook his head, muttering incoherently. Hours later, screams echoed through the mansion. When Elias burst into the study, he found Ashcroft dead, his body twisted unnaturally, his face frozen in a rictus of horror. The portrait now showed an empty chair, blood pooling beneath it. Elias fled the mansion, but he couldn't escape the painting's grip on his mind. He soon realized that Ashcroft's death had sparked a chain reaction. The portrait was now his responsibility, and it had begun to change again. This time, it showed him, standing in his studio, a shadowy figure looming behind him. Desperate, Elias turned to a historian specializing in occult artifacts. Together, they uncovered a chilling truth. The canvas Ashcroft had provided was made from human skin, harvested centuries ago during a ritual meant to trap a vengeful spirit. The spirit fed on the fear and suffering of those it ensnared, using the painting to manipulate events. "You have to destroy it," the historian warned. "But it won't be easy. The spirit won't let go without a fight." Elias returned to his studio, armed with gasoline and a torch. As he approached the portrait, the air grew heavy, and whispers filled the room. The painted version of himself began to move, its mouth twisting into a sinister smile. "You can't destroy me," it hissed. "You're mine." The shadows in the room coalesced into grotesque figures, their skeletal hands reaching for Elias. Panic surged through him, but he struck a match and threw it onto the canvas. Flames roared to life, consuming the painting. The shadows screamed and writhed, their forms dissolving into smoke as the cursed artifact burned. When the fire finally died, the studio was silent. Elias collapsed to his knees, exhausted but alive. The whispers were gone, and the air felt lighter. Though the painting was destroyed, Elias was never the same. He abandoned his art, retreating to a quiet village far from the city. Yet, in his darkest moments, he couldn't shake the feeling that something still watched him from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And in the ashes of his studio, a faint outline of the portrait remained, a chilling reminder that some creations can never truly be undone. Stay tuned for more interesting stories.